Hi there, this is Paul Jansen from United Reformed Church in Somerville, New Jersey, 100 West Main Street in downtown Somerville. We have finished our whole series on the fruit of the Spirit that we were going over this summer, and this scripture and meditation, is for the weekend of Sunday, August the 29th. So we're back on what folks call the Common Lectionary, and I'll be reading from the Gospel according to Mark. Mark, the 7th chapter, and I'll only be reading the first 8 verses. Now, when the Pharisees and some of the scribes who had come from Jerusalem gathered around Jesus, they noticed that some of his disciples were eating with defiled hands, that is, without washing them. The writer tells us, "For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they thoroughly wash their hands, thus observing the tradition of the elders. And they do not eat anything from the market unless they wash it. And there are also many other traditions that they observe, the washing of cups and pots and bronze kettles." The story continues. So the Pharisees and the scribes asked Jesus, "Why do your disciples not live according to the tradition of the elders, but eat with defiled hands?" He said to them, "Isaiah prophesied rightly about you hypocrites, as it's written, 'This people honors me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching human precepts as doctrines. You abandon the commandment of God and hold to human tradition.'" Well, that was the day that Jesus called out the Pharisees and scribes for being hypocrites. The day he invoked Isaiah to tell the religious folks that they weren't practicing what they preached. The day he charged them with treating made-up traditions as being just as important as God's commands. How do you feel when you hear this story? Does Jesus sound to you like a crusading reformer, bold and heroic like Martin Luther or Martin Luther King? If that's how he sound, do his words embolden you? Do they make you want to sign up for the cause? Does Jesus sound to you like kind of a restless, rambunctious young rebel who spouts off about the way his parents saw the world? If that's what you hear, will you just kind of wait him out, as we do sometimes with impetuous youth? Wait him out until he learns a lesson or two about life and starts to appreciate the sacrifice that his parents made on his behalf? Does it sound to you like he's going completely rogue? Like he's cutting down the past, root and branch, which includes the very ground you're standing on? If that's what he's going on about, how could you feel anything but threatened to the very core? How could you want to do anything with Jesus except to do away with him? I wouldn't be surprised to hear you claim any of these responses. When somebody starts picking on your traditions, someone will cheer and some will ignore and others will get out their knives. Traditions matter. They matter a great deal to us. I was at a local funeral home this past Wednesday. A sign on the table said something like, "Pre-plan your funeral. Talk with the director about the benefits of a traditional funeral." Benefits of a traditional funeral. It didn't define traditional. How could you? There are a million different traditions. But anyway, there was some sort of assumption that you would know what it meant and that you would certainly want a traditional service because tradition is comforting and respectful and blessed by time, and it's good. Who wouldn't want a traditional service? Traditions, they matter. You may recall Fiddler on the Roof, right? The brilliant musical from the early 70s based on the stories of Sholem Aleichem. Begins with Tevye, the village milkman, telling us what mattered most to him and to his neighbors in the little village of Anatevka. "A fiddler on the roof," he says, "sounds crazy, huh? But here in this little village of Anatevka, you might say every one of us is a fiddler on the roof, trying to scratch out a pleasant, simple tune without breaking his neck. It isn't easy. You may ask, why do we stay up there if it's so dangerous? How do we keep our balance? That I'll tell you in one word. Tradition. Tradition. Because of our traditions, Tevye says, every one of us knows who he is and what God expects him to do. Who are you? And who does God, what does God expect you to do? How do you answer questions like that? You live your way into the answers, don't you? Who you are and what God expects of you. You have family meals. You have family meals like Thanksgiving every year with the green bean casserole and the sweet potatoes and the turkey and the jello and the cranberry sauce and the bread. You have certain civic responsibilities. You stand for the Pledge of Allegiance and for the flag, and you honor our troops. You come to church into a building that's stood here since 1893, not that old really, and you sing the doxology, which only goes back to 1674, and you pray the Lord's Prayer. Well, okay, that one's a couple thousand years old. And you hear the Ten Commandments now and again, and well, okay, now we're talking really old. We live tradition by practicing traditions. It's how we know who we are, by situating ourselves in these traditions. It's how we know what God expects of us. What did the scribes and Pharisees do after all? They lived into tradition by practicing traditions. Wash your hands before you eat. Wash your vegetables and fruits. Wash the pots and pans, all of them sensible things. But apparently, at least some of the disciples weren't bothering. And yes, it was noticed. Well, Jesus noticed something too. He noticed that, search as you might, you will not find any commandments in God's law about washing your hands. Your mother might have taught you that. And there may have been a sampler on the wall in your bathroom or dining room or something that says cleanliness is next to godliness, to put a little bit of a religious spin on it. And as far as washing hands goes these days, of course, the CDC, yada, yada. But it's not in the Bible. Not in the Bible. What Jesus noticed is that the traditions of the ancestors were not the same as the law of God. These are two different things. Two different things. Do you hear that? The traditions, the practices, are not the tradition, are not the core of what you want to hand on. The shell is not the core. What happens on the outside is not the same as what goes on inside. But boy, it can be so easy to be critical of past practices. Surely our ancestors were doing something right, weren't they? We don't want to just throw everything out, do we? No, of course not. Our religious forebears, surely they got it right. I mean, when they said, forgive us our trespasses, isn't that really the right way to say the Lord's Prayer? When they passed communion down the pews on silver trays and with little glass cups, wasn't that what God approved? Didn't Jesus sing the doxology? No. You may already know the story of the Christmas ham. If you already know it, you can skip ahead. If not, I'll tell you. A boy is helping his mama put the Christmas ham in the oven. She cuts off the end of the ham, wraps the rest in foil, and plunks it in the oven. Little boy asks, Mama, why did you cut the end off the ham? Without thinking, she says, well, that's the way my mommy taught me. That doesn't satisfy his curiosity. Fortunately, since it's Christmas, Grandma's in the other room. So he goes over to Grandma. Grandma, when you made ham for Christmas, did you cut the end off the ham? And Grandma says, I certainly did. Well, why is that, Grandma? And Grandma says, well, it's just the way I saw Great Granny doing it. And since it's Christmas, Great Granny is upstairs taking a nap. And so he goes up to her and shakes her because he's got something on his mind and he's not going to stop until he finds out. Same question. Great Granny answers, well, I'll tell you. I know. It's what your mama did, right? Granny says, no, actually, I just cut off the end of the ham because the oven was too narrow to fit the whole thing in at once. A cute story, but hear it well. Great Granny had a perfectly sensible, perfectly logical reason for cutting off the end of the ham. It was the right thing for her to do. It was totally the right thing for her to do. Her daughter modeled her behavior on her, and so on, from generation to generation. But the tradition of cutting the end off the ham was incidental to the big T tradition of sharing love around the family table. The meal was never about ham. It was always about love. It was always about love. Traditions of the ancestors can both be right for their time, and continuing them can be unnecessary or even wrong for the present time. Both of these things can be true at once. They can both be true at once. I know it might seem harder to keep your balance when the little T traditions go up for grabs, but is it really? Is it really? Let's go back to Tevye on this. He was as dedicated to tradition as anyone in the village. And at the same time, he had daughters whom he loved. Tradition told him that he must arrange a marriage for his oldest daughter, Zeitel. She comes to him, asking him to break tradition, letting her marry for love. Tevye steps outside the tradition and allows it for the sake of love. The second daughter, Hodel, should have asked for permission to marry. Instead, she and her intended ask only for a blessing. Not the way it was supposed to be done, but for the sake of love, Tevye allowed it. How far will this go? How far can it go? A third daughter, Chava, plans to marry a Russian, not a Jew. A Russian whose fellow soldiers ransacked her sister's wedding. This is too far. Tevye won't allow it. He might stretch some traditions, but he can't turn his back on the core. He cannot turn his back on God, because it wasn't so much the traditions that kept Anatevka in balance, that kept that fiddler up there on the roof. It was God's love. It was God's love that was the ballast. It was God's love that gave weight to the traditions. God's love was the weight that kept them wearing prayer shawls and head coverings. God's love was the stabilizer for their society through, despite poverty and pogroms. God's love, sweeter than honey, God's love lived in God's commandments, not in the traditions that others made around them and then tried to enforce on others. And it is God's love, God's self-giving love, greater than which there is no other love. God's love gives you the counterbalance as you try to scratch a simple and pleasant tune out of your life. And isn't that love? Isn't that what we want to pass on, to hand on to our children and our children's children? The love of God, wider than our parochial traditions and higher than our limited imaginations and deeper than our fickle devotion. That's the core of what we've been trying to give away at our church for the last 320 years or so. That's not about human traditions. Oh, sure, they matter. But most important is God's love. It's more important. It's more important than Sunday school or crop walks or musical performances or newsletters or worship programs or dinners or committee meetings or investments or anything else that we worry about. All of these are wise and sensible things to do. But remember what the Apostle Paul said, I can have all the wisdom, I can do all the right things in the world. But if I don't have love, I'm nothing. None of it counts. I'm going to close today with a poem I ran across this week. It's a poem about tradition, a poem about the most important thing that you want to leave behind as a legacy. It's appropriate both to the life of a congregation and to us individually. It's called Epitaph. It's by Merritt Malloy. This is what he writes. I'm going to need my glasses again. When I die, give what's left of me away to children and old men that wait to die. And if you need to cry, cry for your brother walking in the street beside you. And when you need me, put your arms around anyone and give them what you need to give me. I want to leave you something better than words or sounds. Look for me in the people I've known or loved, and if you cannot give me away, at least let me live on in your eyes and not your mind. You can love me most by letting hands touch hands, by letting bodies touch bodies, and by letting go of children that need to be free. Love doesn't die. People do. So when all that's left of me is love, give me away. That's the word for this week. May you be blessed this day and tomorrow and day after day, every day that God gives you, every breath you take in, filled with God's love. Peace be with you.